Feel the gentle pull of history drawing you away from the present moment, away from the demands of today, away from everything that weighs upon your mind. Tonight, you are embarking on a journey that spans centuries, a voyage through the rise and fall of one of history's most magnificent civilizations. The story you're about to hear is one of transformation, of humble beginnings giving way to extraordinary splendor, of a people who built an empire from the waters of a lake and whose legacy still echoes through the centuries. Before we begin this ancient journey together, if you find comfort in these historical sleep stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me create more of these peaceful voyages through time. And in the comments below, let me know which civilization or historical period you'd like to explore next. Now let's continue our journey into the past. Imagine yourself floating above the landscape of ancient Mexico, looking down upon a world that existed long before the rush of modern life. Below you stretches a vast valley cradled between mountain ranges, their peaks touching the clouds, their slopes covered in forests that have witnessed the passage of countless generations. In the heart of this valley lies a system of shimmering lakes, their surfaces reflecting the endless sky above, their waters teeming with life. This is the Valley of Mexico as it once was, a place where the boundaries between earth and water, between the mundane and the sacred, were far more fluid than they are today. The air here is thin and clear, perfumed with the scent of pine from the mountains and the earthy aroma of cultivated fields. You can hear the distant call of waterbirds skimming across the lake surfaces, the rustle of wind through reed beds, the soft splash of canoes cutting through calm waters. This is a world of natural abundance, of fertile soil and ample water, a place that has drawn human communities for thousands of years. But tonight we follow the story of one particular people, a group who would come to be known by many names: the Mexica, the Tanaka, the Aztecs. Their story begins not here in this valley, but far to the north in a place that exists somewhere between history and mythology, between geographical reality and spiritual truth. It is a story of migration and perseverance, of divine guidance and human determination, of struggles overcome and destinies fulfilled. It is a story that will take us from that mythical homeland through centuries of wandering, to the founding of a magnificent city on an island in a lake, through the rise of an empire that would dominate central Mexico, and finally to a tragic encounter that would change the course of history forever. As you listen tonight, let the rhythm of these ancient events carry you deeper into relaxation. Let the rise and fall of civilizations become like the rhythm of your breathing, steady and inevitable. Let the passage of centuries wash over you like gentle waves, each one carrying you further from the concerns of the present and deeper into the realm of peaceful rest. This is a story of human achievement and human fragility, of glory and tragedy, but above all, it is a story that reminds us of the great sweep of time and our small but precious place within it. So settle back now and let us begin at the very beginning in a place called Aztlan, the White Land, where herons gathered by the waters and where a people awaited the call of their god to embark upon a journey that would lead them to greatness. In the realm where memory blends with mythology and historical fact dances with spiritual truth, there existed a place called Aztlan. The very name carries within it the essence of purity and tranquility, for in the Nahuatl language of the Mexica people, Aztlan translates to the place of whiteness, or the place of herons, those elegant birds whose graceful forms were reflected in the still waters that surrounded this legendary homeland. Some scholars place Aztlan somewhere in the northwestern regions of what is now Mexico, perhaps in the modern states of Nayarit or Sinaloa, where lagoons and wetlands still stretch beneath vast skies. Others suggest it may have lain even further north, possibly in territories that would later become part of the southwestern United States. But perhaps the precise geographical location matters less than the spiritual and cultural significance this place held in the hearts and memories of the Mexica people. According to the sacred narratives preserved in ancient codices and oral traditions that survived the conquest, Aztlan was conceived as a paradise, an island of abundance floating upon a great lake. The land was fertile beyond measure, producing crops without the toil and hardship that would characterize the Mexica's later years of wandering. Fish swam in such profusion that they could be plucked from the waters with ease, and waterfowl darkened the skies with their numbers, their calls echoing across the peaceful lagoons. The people who dwelt in Aztlan were said to live in harmony with this bounty, their lives marked by simplicity and sufficiency, their days flowing one into another with the rhythm of the seasons and the cycles of nature. In the center of this idyllic landscape rose a prominent hill called Calhuacan, and within this hill were 7 caves known as Chicamostoc, the place of the 7 caves. These caves held profound significance in Mexica cosmology, for they were understood to be the wombs from which different Nahuatl-speaking peoples had emerged into the world. 7 distinct tribal groups made their homes in these caves: the Xochimilca, the Calca, the Tepaneca, the Acalua, the Tlahuica, the Tlaxcalans, and finally the Mexica themselves, who were the last to emerge and the last to leave when the time came for migration. Each group maintained its own identity and leadership structure, yet all shared common linguistic roots and cultural foundations that bound them together as children of the same primordial landscape. Life in Aztlan was not merely materially abundant but spiritually rich as well. The people maintained close relationships with their gods, particularly with Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the fierce war god who would later become the supreme patron deity of the Mexica people. In Aztlan, Huitzilopochtli was perhaps not yet the bloodthirsty god of war and sacrifice that he would become, but rather a protective presence, a guiding spirit who watched over his chosen people and prepared them for the great destiny that awaited them. The relationship between the people and their gods was intimate and immediate, woven into the fabric of daily life through rituals, offerings, and constant awareness of the sacred forces that animated the world. The departure from Aztlan was not a matter of choice or desire but of divine command. According to the sacred histories, Huitzilopochtli appeared to the priests and wise men of the Mexica, commanding them to abandon their comfortable homeland and embark upon a journey to the south. The god promised them a new land, a place where they would rise to greatness and rule over many peoples, but first they must endure a long period of trial and wandering. The prophecy spoke of a specific sign that would mark the location of their destined homeland: an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. This vivid image, which would eventually become the central symbol on the modern Mexican flag, represented the cosmic balance between opposing forces, the triumph of the sun and the sky over the powers of the earth and water. The Mexica received this divine mandate with both reverence and trepidation. To leave Aztlan meant abandoning the security and abundance they had always known, venturing into unknown territories inhabited by strange peoples, facing hardships and dangers that could barely be imagined. Yet to refuse the command of their patron god was unthinkable, for the Mexica understood themselves to exist in a reciprocal relationship with the divine realm. The gods had given them life, sustenance, and identity. In return, the people owed complete obedience and faithful service. And so, sometime in the 12th century, though the exact date remains uncertain and varies in different historical accounts, the Mexica gathered their few portable possessions, said farewell to the only home they had ever known, and set their faces toward the south. The migration from Aztlan was not a single unified journey but rather a series of movements that unfolded in waves over an extended period. The other tribal groups from Chichimastoc had departed earlier, following their own paths and divine guidance toward their destinies in central Mexico. The Mexica were the last to leave, and this late departure would have profound consequences for their future, as they would arrive in the Valley of Mexico to find the most desirable lands already occupied by established civilizations. They traveled on foot, carrying their children, their elderly, and their sacred bundles containing the images and relics of their gods. They brought with them the knowledge of their crafts, their agricultural techniques, and most importantly, their identity as a distinct people with a glorious destiny promised by Huitzilopochtli. As the Mexica moved southward, they left behind the landscape of their origins and entered new ecological zones. The semi-arid plateaus of northern Mexico stretched before them, lands where water was scarce and survival required constant vigilance and adaptation. They passed through territories inhabited by other groups, some related to them by language and culture, others completely foreign. Sometimes they were welcomed as kin or valuable allies, other times they were met with hostility and forced to fight for the right to pass through or to temporarily settle. These encounters shaped the Mexica character, hardening them through adversity, teaching them the skills of diplomacy and warfare that would serve them well in the centuries to come. The journey was marked by numerous stops, some lasting mere days, others extending for months or even years. At each location, the priests would consult with Huitzilopochtli through divination and ritual, seeking guidance about whether this place might be their promised homeland. But always the answer was the same: continue south, the destined land still awaits. And so they would gather their belongings once more and resume their wandering, following the invisible thread of destiny that pulled them ever onward. During these temporary settlements, they practiced their traditional way of life, combining hunting and gathering with small-scale agriculture wherever conditions permitted. They grew maize, beans, and squash, the sacred trinity of crops that had sustained Mesoamerican peoples for millennia. They hunted deer, rabbits, and other game animals, and they gathered wild plants, nuts, and fruits to supplement their diet. The material culture of the migrating Mexica reflected their nomadic lifestyle. They could not accumulate heavy or bulky possessions, so they crafted objects that were portable yet functional. Their pottery was relatively simple and utilitarian, their textiles woven from plant fibers available along their route. But they carried with them something far more valuable than material goods. They carried their stories, their songs, their ritual knowledge, and their unshakable faith in Huitzilopochtli's promise. These intangible treasures would sustain them through the hardest moments of their journey, providing meaning and purpose when physical circumstances might otherwise have counseled despair. The Mexica migration took them through diverse landscapes and climates. They crossed arid plains where the sun beat down mercilessly and water sources were few and far between. They navigated through mountain ranges where the thin air made every step an effort and where sudden storms could transform familiar trails into dangerous passages. They followed river valleys where vegetation grew thick and game was plentiful, providing welcome respite from harsher environments. Each landscape taught them new lessons, developed new skills, and added new elements to their growing cultural repertoire. The Mexica who would eventually arrive in the Valley of Mexico would be very different from the people who had left Aztlan, tempered by their experiences, enriched by their encounters with other cultures, and united by their shared ordeal. As they traveled, the Mexica maintained their social organization through the Calpulli system, which served as the fundamental building block of their society. Each Calpulli was essentially a kinship group descended from a common ancestor, and each maintained its own leadership, its own patron deity, and its own distinctive identity within the larger tribal structure. The Calpulli system provided stability and continuity during the long migration, ensuring that even when the people were scattered across temporary campsites or divided during difficult passages, they maintained their cohesion as a unified community. The leaders of each Calpulli formed a council that made important decisions affecting the entire group, always in consultation with the priests who served as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The priests held a position of particular importance during the migration, for they carried the sacred bundle containing the image of Huitzilopochtli and served as the interpreters of the god's will. They performed the daily rituals that maintained the proper relationship between the people and their deity, conducting ceremonies of thanksgiving when food was plentiful and ceremonies of supplication when hardship threatened the community's survival. They also maintained the sacred calendar, that complex interweaving of cycles that governed religious observances, determined auspicious dates for important activities, and provided a framework for understanding time itself. Through their ritual activities, the priests ensured that even though the Mexica were far from Aztlan and wandering through unfamiliar territories, they remained connected to the sacred order that gave meaning to their existence. The exact duration of the Mexica migration remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some indigenous sources suggest it lasted approximately 200 years, meaning the people who finally reached the Valley of Mexico were descendants many generations removed from those who had first departed Aztlan. Other interpretations of the chronological evidence suggest a shorter period, perhaps beginning in the late 1100s and concluding with the founding of Tenochtitlan in 1325. Regardless of the precise time frame, the migration was clearly an experience that spanned multiple generations, becoming less a memory of specific events and more a foundational narrative that shaped Mexica identity and self-understanding. The stories told around campfires during this long journey, the songs sung to commemorate trials overcome and enemies defeated, the rituals performed to maintain divine favor, all of these became woven into the collective consciousness of the people, creating a shared history that bound them together as a distinct ethnic and cultural group with a unique destiny. The southward journey of the Mexica unfolded across generations, each step carrying them closer to the destiny promised by Huitzilopochtli, yet each new horizon revealing only more challenges to overcome and more territories to traverse. The migration was not a straight line marching directly toward the Valley of Mexico, but rather a meandering path determined by the availability of resources, the political landscape of the regions they passed through, and the guidance received through priestly divination and divine revelation. This was a journey measured not in days or weeks but in lifetimes, with grandchildren hearing stories from their grandparents about the distant homeland of Aztlan that none of the living had ever seen with their own eyes. As the Mexica continued their migration, they began to encounter more complex and sophisticated societies. The further south they traveled, the more densely populated the landscape became, and the more developed the civilizations they encountered. These were no longer simple villages or nomadic bands like themselves, but organized city-states with permanent architecture, hierarchical social structures, and long-established territorial claims. The Mexica, arriving as outsiders and latecomers, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of supplicants seeking permission to pass through or temporarily settle in lands controlled by more powerful groups who viewed these northern wanderers with suspicion and often contempt. The dominant powers of central Mexico during this period included several major city-states that controlled extensive territories and commanded the loyalty of numerous subject communities. Culhuacan stood out as particularly prestigious, for its ruling lineage claimed direct descent from the ancient Toltecs, whose civilization had flourished centuries earlier and whose cultural achievements were remembered with reverence throughout Mesoamerica. To be associated with Culhuacan and its Toltec heritage was to possess a kind of cultural legitimacy that the Mexica, as recent arrivals from the barbarous north, distinctly lacked. Other important powers included Azcapotzalco, the capital of the Tepanec people who controlled the western portions of the valley, Texcoco, home to the Acalua people who dominated the eastern regions, and various smaller city-states including Chalco, Xochimilco, and Tlatelolco, each maintaining its own territory, its own ruling dynasty, and its own networks of alliance and rivalry. The established peoples of central Mexico referred to northern migrants like the Mexica as Chichimeca, a term that translates roughly as dog people and carried connotations of barbarism and cultural inferiority. The Chichimeca were seen as uncivilized nomads who lacked the refinement, learning, and sophisticated traditions of the valley's settled populations. They did not build stone temples or permanent cities, they did not maintain elaborate ceremonial calendars or preserve complex historical records and painted codices, they did not speak with the eloquence and grace expected of educated nobles. Yet the Mexica possessed certain qualities that the valley powers found valuable. They were fierce and disciplined warriors, having honed their military skills during their long migration through hostile territories. They were adaptable and resourceful, capable of surviving and even thriving in marginal environments that more comfortable city dwellers would have found impossible. And they were hungry for opportunity, willing to undertake dangerous missions and make great sacrifices in exchange for the chance to establish themselves in this promised land. The Mexica's first significant patron in the Valley of Mexico was indeed Culhuacan, whose rulers recognized the military potential of these newcomers despite their humble origins. The Culhua kings employed Mexico warriors as mercenaries in their conflicts with rival city-states, particularly against the Xochimilca people who inhabited the Chinampas and settlements in the southern portion of Lake Texcoco. The Mexica proved themselves exceptionally effective in this role, demonstrating not only martial prowess but also a willingness to engage in the kind of brutal warfare that more civilized warriors might have found distasteful. They adapted quickly to the unique challenges of fighting in the lake environment, learning to use canoes effectively in combat and developing tactics suited to the marshy terrain that characterized much of the valley floor. However, the relationship between the Mexica and Culhuacan eventually deteriorated due to cultural and religious tensions. The Mexica maintained religious practices that even by the standards of Mesoamerican ritual violence seemed excessive and barbaric to their Culhua patrons. Their forms of human sacrifice and their particular devotion to Huitzilopochtli, with all the blood offerings this entailed, offended the sensibilities of the more established peoples who viewed themselves as heirs to the refined Toltec tradition. Additionally, as the Mexica grew in confidence and capability, they began to exhibit a level of independence and assertiveness that made their patrons increasingly uncomfortable. The Culhua rulers recognized that these useful mercenaries might eventually become dangerous competitors, and tensions rose until the relationship finally broke down in conflict that forced the Mexica to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The Mexica next offered their services to Azcapotzalco, the powerful Tepanec capital that dominated the western valley. The Tepanec ruler Tezozomoc was building an empire through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, and he welcomed the addition of experienced Mexica warriors to his forces. Under Tepanec patronage, the Mexica participated in campaigns throughout the valley and beyond, fighting against Texcoco and other rival powers, helping to suppress rebellions in tributary communities, and serving as shock troops in major battles where their ferocity and discipline proved decisive. These military experiences provided the Mexica with invaluable knowledge of the valley's geography, political dynamics, and economic resources. They learned which communities were wealthy and which were poor, which alliances were strong and which were vulnerable to exploitation, which territories offered valuable resources like salt deposits or obsidian sources or fertile farmland. Despite their military success and growing reputation, the Mexica remained fundamentally dependent on their more powerful patrons. They lived in marginal locations on the periphery of established territories, always subject to potential displacement if they lost favor with the ruling powers. They possessed neither land they could call their own nor the political independence that came with controlling a recognized territory. This precarious situation created a powerful motivation to find a permanent homeland where they could establish their own city-state and control their own destiny. The Mexica leaders dreamed of the day when they would no longer serve as hired warriors for others but would command their own empire, collecting tribute rather than paying it, giving orders rather than receiving them. The sacred promise of Huitzilopochtli remained the guiding principle throughout these years of service to other powers. The priests continued to consult with their patron deity, seeking the sign that would indicate their promised homeland had finally been reached. They searched everywhere they traveled, examining the marshes and islands of the lake system, looking for the prophesied eagle perched upon a cactus devouring a serpent. But for decades the sign did not appear, and the Mexica continued their service to the Tepanecs, growing in strength and number, learning the arts of civilization from their more established neighbors, and waiting with increasing impatience for the fulfillment of the divine promise that had sustained them through 2 centuries of wandering. During this period of service to more powerful patrons, the Mexica underwent a profound cultural transformation. They absorbed elements of the sophisticated civilizations they encountered, adopting new technologies, learning new crafts, and incorporating foreign deities into their religious pantheon alongside Huitzilopochtli. They learned to construct permanent buildings using stone and adobe, replacing the temporary structures of their nomadic past. They developed more complex social hierarchies, differentiating between nobles who claimed descent from important ancestors and commoners who formed the bulk of the population. They began to practice intensive agriculture rather than the simple farming of their migration years, learning techniques suited to the unique environment of the valley's lake system. They acquired literacy in the pictographic writing system used throughout Mesoamerica, enabling them to keep records, compose historical narratives, and preserve religious knowledge in painted books similar to those maintained by older civilizations. This cultural evolution required the Mexica to walk a delicate balance between maintaining their distinct identity as a people with a unique destiny and adapting sufficiently to gain acceptance among the established powers of the valley. They could not afford to appear so different and barbaric that they would be rejected entirely, yet they also needed to preserve the core elements of their culture and the special relationship with Huitzilopochtli that defined them as Mexica rather than simply another group of valley inhabitants. Their success in maintaining this balance, in becoming sophisticated enough to be respected while remaining distinctive enough to maintain group cohesion, would prove crucial to their eventual rise to power. The religious life of the migrating and then semi-settled Mexica centered increasingly on Huitzilopochtli as their supreme patron deity, though they also paid homage to other gods including Tlaloc the rain god, Quetzalcoatl the feathered serpent, and various deities associated with maize, fertility, and warfare. The priests maintained elaborate ceremonial calendars that intertwined a 260-day ritual cycle with a 365-day solar year, creating complex patterns of sacred time that governed religious observances and determined auspicious dates for important activities. Human sacrifice played an increasingly central role in Mexican religious practice, with captives taken in warfare offered to the gods to ensure divine favor, agricultural fertility, and cosmic order. The Mexica understood these sacrifices not as acts of cruelty but as necessary obligations in a universe that required constant nourishment of the divine forces that maintained existence itself. The military culture of the Mexica developed sophisticated institutions during this period of service to various patrons. Young men underwent rigorous training in warfare from an early age, learning to use traditional Mesoamerican weapons including the macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades that could decapitate an opponent with a single blow. They mastered the use of spears, including the atlotl or spear thrower that increased the range and force of projectiles. They practiced with bows and arrows, slings and clubs, developing the skills needed for both individual combat and coordinated battlefield maneuvers. The most accomplished warriors earned distinction through capturing enemies alive for sacrifice rather than simply killing them in battle, for such captives represented the highest form of offering to the gods. Warrior societies emerged as important social and religious institutions within Mexica culture. The most prestigious of these were the Eagle Knights and Jaguar Knights, elite warriors who had distinguished themselves through exceptional battlefield achievements and who wore elaborate costumes representing their respective totemic animals during ceremonies and combat. These warrior societies provided social mobility within Mexica culture, allowing commoners to rise to positions of honor and influence through demonstrated martial prowess. The existence of these military institutions ensured that the Mexica maintained a large pool of skilled, motivated warriors ready to serve their community's interests, whether in the service of foreign patrons or eventually in the conquest of an empire of their own. As the decades passed and the Mexica continued to serve various masters while growing in strength and sophistication, the question of when and where they would finally establish their permanent homeland became increasingly pressing. The priests intensified their divinations and religious observations, seeking any indication that the promised sign was near. The people grew restless, weary of their dependent status and eager to fulfill the destiny that Huitzilopochtli had promised their ancestors so many generations before. The stage was being set for the pivotal moment when the prophecy would finally be fulfilled, when the eagle would appear on the cactus with a serpent in its talons, and when the Mexica would at last find the place where they would build their great city and begin their transformation from wandering mercenaries into the masters of central Mexico. The year 1325 marks one of the most significant moments in the history of the Americas, though few could have recognized its importance at the time. In that year, according to Mexica tradition, the wandering people who had left Aztlan generations before finally received the sign they had been seeking for so long. On a small, marshy island in the western portion of Lake Texcoco, Mexica scouts witnessed an extraordinary sight. A magnificent eagle perched atop a prickly pear cactus, and clutched in the eagle's talons was a serpent, writhing as the great bird devoured it. This image, prophesied by Huitzilopochtli at the beginning of their migration, marked the location where the Mexica would finally establish their permanent home and build the city that would become the heart of an empire. The location indicated by the divine sign was, from a practical perspective, far from ideal. The island occupied barely 2 square kilometers of swampy land that rose only slightly above the lake's surface during the dry season and was regularly inundated during the annual rains that fell from May through September. The surrounding waters of Lake Texcoco contained high concentrations of dissolved minerals, making them brackish and unsuitable for either drinking or irrigation. The nearest sources of building stone lay many kilometers away on the valley's rim, accessible only by canoe transport across open water that could become treacherous during storms. There was no readily available timber for construction, no farmland for growing crops, and the island's small size meant that even basic needs like housing the population would require innovative solutions. Yet the Mexica understood that the practical challenges of the location were irrelevant compared to its spiritual significance. Huitzilopochtli had chosen this place, and that divine selection transformed what appeared to be an uninhabitable swamp into sacred ground, the axis mundi where the human and divine realms intersected. The eagle represented Huitzilopochtli himself in his solar aspect. The cactus symbolized the precious nourishment that sustained life, and the serpent embodied the earth and water forces that the solar deity must perpetually overcome to maintain cosmic order. By establishing their city at this location, the Mexica were positioning themselves at the center of the sacred geography, the place from which they would extend their influence in all directions like the rays of the sun. The initial settlement on the island was modest in the extreme, consisting of simple huts built on raised platforms to protect them from seasonal flooding. These early structures were constructed using techniques the Mexica had perfected during their nomadic period. Walls woven from reeds gathered from the lake margins and covered with mud plaster, roofs thatched with water grasses, floors made of packed earth mixed with crushed shells and pottery shards to improve drainage. The settlers organized themselves according to the traditional Calpulli system, with each kinship group occupying a distinct section of the island and maintaining its own small temple dedicated to its patron deity. In the center of the settlement, they began constructing a modest shrine to Huitzilopochtli, the first incarnation of what would eventually become the magnificent Templo Mayor that dominated the city's sacred precinct. Fresh water presented one of the most immediate and persistent challenges facing the new settlement. The brackish lake water was unsuitable for drinking, forcing the Mexica to develop ingenious solutions to provide their growing population with adequate supplies of potable water. They dug shallow wells that tapped into underground freshwater springs flowing beneath the lake bed, and they constructed elaborate systems of channels and reservoirs to collect and store rainwater. Later, as the city grew and its water demands increased, they would build aqueducts connecting the island to freshwater springs on the mainland, particularly those at Chapultepec, the Hill of the Grasshopper, which would remain an important source of water for the city throughout its existence. The agricultural problem required equally innovative solutions. The Mexica could not simply transplant their traditional farming methods to this aquatic environment, where there was essentially no soil and where the island's limited size precluded conventional agriculture. Instead, they began developing and perfecting the Chinampa system, creating artificial islands by piling up mud dredged from the lake bottom, lake vegetation and organic matter within rectangular frameworks constructed from woven reeds and anchored with wooden stakes. These Chinampa plots, which Spanish observers would later misname floating gardens, were extraordinarily productive, yielding multiple harvests per year of maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers and flowers. The constant availability of water and nutrients from the lake bed, combined with the mild climate of the valley, created ideal growing conditions that could support a population density far exceeding what traditional agriculture would have allowed. The construction and maintenance of chinampas required sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry, hydrology, and plant biology. The Mexica learned through experimentation which combinations of materials created the most stable and fertile growing platforms, how to manage water levels to prevent flooding or drought, and how to maintain the structural integrity of their artificial islands against the constant erosion of wind and waves. They planted willow trees along the edges of each chinampa, whose extensive root systems anchored the islands in place and whose branches provided materials for tools and construction. The spaces between chinampas formed canals that served both as transportation routes, allowing canoes to move throughout the agricultural zone, and as sources of fresh nutrients and organic matter that could be continuously added to the growing surfaces to maintain their fertility. As the chinampa system expanded and became more productive, the island settlement began to transform from a precarious camp of refugees into a viable urban center. The agricultural surplus enabled the population to grow beyond simple subsistence level, supporting specialized craftspeople, merchants, priests, and administrators who were not directly involved in food production. The increasing population required the island itself to be expanded through the same techniques used for creating chinampas, with new land reclaimed from the lake to accommodate growing neighborhoods of houses, temples, and public spaces. What had begun as a tiny island barely above water was gradually engineered into an urban platform capable of supporting tens of thousands of inhabitants. Simultaneously with the development of Tenochtitlan, another Mexica settlement was taking shape on a nearby island in Lake Texcoco. Tlatelolco, whose name means place of the round earth mound, was founded by a related group of Mexica who had separated from the main body during the final phase of the migration, possibly due to internal disputes over leadership or religious practices. Located approximately 3 kilometers north of Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco's island was slightly larger and higher above the water level, and the surrounding waters were somewhat less saline, providing certain advantages for initial settlement. Despite their political separation, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco maintained close cultural and economic ties, sharing the same language, worshipping the same gods, and frequently intermarrying, creating kinship networks that transcended political boundaries. The relationship between the two Mexica cities developed along complementary lines. Tenochtitlan's leaders focused primarily on military and political activities, building relationships with other valley powers and developing the warrior institutions that would eventually enable imperial conquest. Tlatelolco's rulers, in contrast, concentrated on developing their settlement as a commercial center. Tlatelolco's merchants, the Pactica, developed extensive trade relationships that reached far beyond the valley, traveling to the Gulf Coast, the Pacific coastal regions, and the southern territories that would later be incorporated into the Aztec Empire. These long-distance traders served multiple functions. They brought valuable exotic goods to the valley, they provided intelligence about distant regions, and they served as unofficial ambassadors, establishing relationships that could later be formalized through military or diplomatic means. The construction of causeways connecting the island settlements to the mainland became one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the early period. The first causeway linked Tenochtitlan to the western shore of the lake, providing direct access to the territories controlled by Azcapotzalco and enabling more efficient movement of people and goods between the island and the mainland. The causeway stretched approximately 8 kilometers across the shallow waters, requiring the construction of thousands of wooden pilings driven deep into the lake bed to support the roadway. Horizontal beams were lashed to these pilings using ropes made from maguey fibers, creating a framework that could support the weight of foot traffic and cargo carriers. The roadway itself consisted of a thick layer of stones and packed earth raised approximately 1 meter above the normal water level to prevent flooding during storms. At regular intervals, the causeway was interrupted by removable wooden bridges that served dual purposes. They allowed canoe traffic to pass beneath the causeway, maintaining the free flow of waterborne commerce, and they could be withdrawn in case of attack, transforming the causeway into a defensive barrier that would trap enemies on the islands. This defensive feature would prove crucial in the city's later history, though it would ultimately be insufficient to prevent the Spanish conquest. Additional causeways followed in subsequent decades, connecting Tenochtitlan to the northern and southern shores of the lake and creating a comprehensive transportation network that made the island city the hub of valley commerce. Each causeway incorporated lessons learned from previous construction, resulting in increasingly sophisticated engineering solutions. The northern causeway featured elaborate bridge systems and included raised sections that provided panoramic views of the surrounding lake. The southern causeway incorporated a double-channel aqueduct that brought fresh water from springs on the mainland to supply the city's growing population. The development of the canal system within the city itself paralleled the construction of the causeways. The primary canals followed the natural contours of the expanded island, providing navigable waterways that allowed cargo canoes to reach markets and residential areas throughout the settlement. Secondary canals served as drainage channels that carried away excess water during the rainy season, while sophisticated hydraulic features including wooden sluice gates allowed engineers to control water flow between different sections of the canal network, regulating water levels according to seasonal needs and preventing flooding in residential areas. The urban planning of Tenochtitlan reflected a careful balance between practical necessity and religious symbolism. The city was organized around a central ceremonial precinct that housed the most important temples and government buildings. This sacred center was aligned with the cardinal directions according to Mesoamerican cosmological principles, with the main temple pyramid facing west toward the setting sun, the daily destination of Huitzilopochtli's celestial journey. The ceremonial precinct was surrounded by concentric zones of residential neighborhoods, markets and specialized craft workshops, each with its own internal organization and leadership structure based on the traditional Kalpuli system. The residential areas developed according to the traditional kinship-based organization, with each Kalpuli occupying a distinct neighborhood that included houses, gardens, and small temples dedicated to the group's patron deities. The houses themselves were built using techniques adapted to the unique environment of the lake city. Foundations consisted of wooden platforms raised above the normal water level and anchored to pilings driven into the island's substrate. Walls were constructed using a combination of stone where available, adobe bricks made from lake mud mixed with straw, and wooden frames filled with wattle and daub, depending on the availability of materials and the wealth of the occupants. Roofs were typically thatched with grasses or, for wealthier residents, covered with wooden shingles. The establishment of formal political institutions accompanied the physical development of Tenochtitlan. The position of Huitzilopochtli, meaning Great Speaker, emerged as the supreme authority in the growing city-state. The first individual to hold this title was Tenech, the legendary leader whose name became incorporated into the city's official designation as Tenochtitlan, literally meaning place of Tenech. Historical sources provide limited information about Tenech's actual reign, which likely began around 1325 and continued until his death around 1375, but later traditions credited him with establishing many of the fundamental institutions that would govern Mexican society for the next 2 centuries. The Huitzilopochtli served multiple roles within Mexican society. As secular ruler, he led the community in warfare, oversaw the distribution of land and resources, and served as the final arbiter in legal disputes. As high priest, he conducted the most important religious ceremonies and maintained the proper relationships between the human and divine realms through elaborate rituals and sacrifices. The position was theoretically elective, with the ruler chosen by a council of nobles from among the eligible members of the royal lineage, though in practice the succession often followed hereditary patterns with the throne passing from brother to brother or from uncle to nephew. Supporting the Huitzilopochtli was a complex bureaucracy that managed various aspects of city administration. The Cihuacotl, whose title literally means woman serpent, served as the ruler's principal deputy and handled many of the day-to-day administrative responsibilities. Military affairs were coordinated by specialized war leaders who commanded the various warrior societies, including the elite Eagle Knights and Jaguar Knights. Religious activities were managed by a hierarchy of priests who maintained the elaborate ceremonial calendar and conducted the rituals essential to the community's spiritual well-being. The social hierarchy that emerged in early Tenochtitlan reflected both traditional Mexica values and adaptations to their new urban environment. At the apex of society stood the Pipiltin, the noble class that included the royal family, high-ranking warriors, and senior priests. The Pipiltin controlled most of the city's wealth and held the majority of important political and religious offices. Their children received specialized education in schools called Kalmakak, where they learned reading, writing, astronomy, history, and religious ritual. The Masahualtin, the commoners, comprised the vast majority of Tenochtitlan's population. They worked as farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and laborers. While they lacked the political privileges of the nobility, the Masahualtin enjoyed considerable social mobility through military service or commercial success. Exceptional warriors could earn noble status through their battlefield achievements, while successful merchants could accumulate wealth that rivaled that of hereditary nobles. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the Tlacotin, individuals who had been enslaved through warfare, debt, or criminal conviction. Slavery in Mexican society differed significantly from later plantation systems. Slaves retained certain legal rights, could own property, marry freely, and have children who were born free. Many slaves worked as domestic servants in noble households, and they could potentially earn or purchase their freedom. The religious life of early Tenochtitlan centered around the worship of Huitzilopochtli, whose guidance had brought the Mexica to their island home. The first temple dedicated to the war god was modest, but it served as the focal point for elaborate ceremonies that reinforced community identity and maintained the proper relationship with the divine realm. Alongside Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica worshipped numerous other deities including Tlaloc the rain god, Quetzalcoatl the feathered serpent, and various goddesses associated with earth and fertility. The development of Tenochtitlan from a precarious refugee settlement into a viable urban center required approximately 50 years of sustained effort and innovation. By the late 14th century, the city housed several thousand inhabitants and controlled sufficient agricultural resources through the expanding Chinampa system to support not only the urban population but also to produce surpluses for trade. Yet despite their impressive achievements, the Mexica remained politically subordinate to Azcapotzalco, whose Tepanec rulers demanded tribute and maintained ultimate authority over Mexica foreign relations and military activities. The death of Ximalpopoca, the third Huitzilopochtli of Tenochtitlan, in 1427 marked a pivotal moment that would transform the Mexica from tributary subjects into the dominant power of central Mexico. Ximalpopoca's assassination, orchestrated by Maxtla, the ambitious new ruler of Azcapotzalco, represented the culmination of growing tensions between the Tepanec Empire and its increasingly assertive Mexica vassals. The young Tanaka ruler had been strangled in his palace during what appeared to be a diplomatic meeting, a betrayal that shocked the Mexican nobility and provided the catalyst for revolutionary change. The succession crisis that followed Ximalpopoca's murder revealed deep divisions within Mexica society. Conservative nobles favored maintaining the tributary relationship with Azcapotzalco, arguing that open rebellion would result in the destruction of their still vulnerable island city. They pointed to the overwhelming military superiority of the Tepanec Empire, which controlled most of the western and northern shores of Lake Texcoco and commanded tribute from dozens of subordinate communities. However, a faction led by Itzcoatl, Ximalpopoca's uncle and a seasoned military commander, advocated for armed resistance. Itzcoatl had spent decades observing the internal weaknesses of the Tepanec Empire during his service as a war leader. He recognized that Maxtla's aggressive policies had created widespread resentment among many of Azcapotzalco's tributaries, particularly the powerful city-state of Texcoco. The death of Ixtlahuaxtli, the legitimate ruler of Texcoco, at Tepanec hands had created a potential ally in his son Nezahualcoyotl, whose desire for revenge matched that of the Mexica. Itzcoatl's election as the new Huitzilopochtli represented a decisive rejection of accommodation with Azcapotzalco. The new ruler was approximately 50 years old at the time of his accession, a mature leader whose military experience and political acumen had earned him respect throughout Mexica society. His first priority was to forge alliances that could counterbalance Tepanec military superiority. The most crucial diplomatic initiative involved secret negotiations with Nezahualcoyotl, the exiled prince of Texcoco who had been living as a fugitive since his father's death. Nezahualcoyotl possessed detailed knowledge of Tepanec military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, having spent years planning his campaign to reclaim his ancestral throne. The alliance between Itzcoatl and Nezahualcoyotl was formalized through a series of clandestine meetings held on small islands in the northern part of Lake Texcoco. These negotiations required extraordinary secrecy, as Maxtla had placed substantial bounties on both leaders. The third member of what would become the Triple Alliance was Totocahuatzin, the ruler of Tlacopan, a smaller city-state located on the western shore of the lake. Tlacopan's inclusion reflected both strategic necessity and political calculation. The city controlled important trade routes between the valley and regions to the west, and its cooperation was essential for maintaining supply lines during the anticipated conflict with Azcapotzalco. The formal establishment of the Triple Alliance, known in Nahuatl as the Excan-Tlahtoloyan or Three Speakers, occurred in 1428 through elaborate ceremonies that invoked ancient Mesoamerican traditions of confederation. The three rulers met at a neutral location and participated in ritual bloodletting that symbolically bound their lineages together in perpetual alliance. Each leader contributed drops of blood to a sacred fire while priests chanted invocations to the gods, requesting divine approval for their confederation. The terms of the alliance were carefully negotiated to reflect the relative contributions of each partner. Tenochtitlan, as the initiator of the rebellion and the largest contributor of military forces, was accorded the dominant position. The Mexica ruler would serve as supreme military commander during joint campaigns and would receive the largest share of tribute from conquered territories. Texcoco, in recognition of Nezahualcóyotl's political legitimacy and administrative expertise, was granted authority over the eastern regions and responsibility for managing the alliance's legal and bureaucratic affairs. Tlacopan received control over western territories and a guaranteed portion of tribute revenues. The division of tribute followed a carefully calculated formula that would persist throughout the empire's existence. Tenochtitlan claimed 2/5 of all tribute collected from conquered territories. Texcoco received 2/5 as well, acknowledging its crucial role in the alliance. Tlacopan received the remaining 1/5, a proportion that recognized its smaller size while ensuring its continued loyalty to the Confederation. The military preparations for the war against Azcapotzalco required unprecedented coordination among the three allied city-states. Tenochtitlan provided the largest contingent of infantry warriors, drawn from its expanding population of Masahualtin trained in traditional Mexica warrior societies. Texcoco's military contribution focused on elite warrior units and specialized tactical knowledge. Nezahualcóyotl had spent his years in exile studying military innovations, and he introduced new concepts that enhanced the alliance's effectiveness. Tlacopan's forces were particularly valuable for their knowledge of local terrain and their expertise in amphibious operations. The role of Tlacopan, Itzcoatl's nephew and principal advisor, proved crucial in transforming these military preparations into a comprehensive strategy for imperial expansion. Tlacopan held the position of Cihuacótl, making him the second-ranking official in the Mexica government. Unlike previous holders of this office who had focused primarily on internal governance, Tlacopan envisioned a radical restructuring of Mexica society to support sustained military expansion and imperial administration. Tlacopan's reforms began with the reorganization of Mexica military institutions to create a more professional and effective fighting force. The traditional warrior societies were transformed into disciplined military units with standardized training, equipment, and command structures. Young men were required to undergo rigorous physical conditioning and combat training from an early age, with advancement through the warrior hierarchy dependent on demonstrated battlefield prowess. The most significant military innovation was the institutionalization of the Flowery Wars, ritualized conflicts designed to provide opportunities for warriors to capture enemies for sacrifice while avoiding the complete destruction of potential tributary states. These carefully regulated battles served multiple purposes. They maintained the fighting skills of Mexica warriors during peacetime, provided a steady supply of sacrificial victims for religious ceremonies, and demonstrated Mexica military superiority to potential enemies. Religious reforms accompanied these military changes as Tlacopan sought to create an ideological foundation for Mexica imperial ambitions. The cult of Huitzilopochtli was elevated above all other deities in the Mexica pantheon, with the war god portrayed as the divine patron of imperial expansion. New myths were created or existing stories modified to emphasize Huitzilopochtli's role as champion of the Mexica people and to establish their divine right to rule over central Mexico. The practice of human sacrifice was systematized and expanded under Tlacopan's direction, becoming a central element of state policy rather than merely a religious observance. Large-scale sacrificial ceremonies were organized to coincide with major military campaigns, with hundreds of captive warriors offered to the gods to ensure divine favor for Mexica armies. These spectacular rituals demonstrated Mexica power to allies and enemies alike. The war against Azcapotzalco began in earnest during the dry season of 1428, when the Allied forces launched coordinated attacks against Tepanec strongholds throughout the Western Valley. Mexica forces, supported by Texcocan siege specialists and Tlacopan intelligence operatives, systematically reduced Tepanec outposts while disrupting enemy supply lines through amphibious raids. The siege of Azcapotzalco itself lasted for several months and demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's coordinated strategy. Mexica infantry surrounded the city's landward approaches. Texcocan engineers constructed siege works that enabled attackers to breach the city's defenses. Tlacopan canoes controlled the lake approaches, intercepting supply convoys and preventing the evacuation of Tepanec leadership. Maxtla's death during the final assault on Azcapotzalco marked the end of Tepanec dominance in the Valley of Mexico. The fall of the city was followed by systematic destruction of its temples and administrative buildings, symbolically erasing the political and religious foundations of Tepanec power. The surviving population was relocated to other communities throughout the valley, preventing any future revival of Tepanec independence. The victory over Azcapotzalco transformed the political landscape of central Mexico and established the Triple Alliance as the dominant power in the region. The wealth captured during the conquest funded massive construction projects in all three allied cities, including the expansion of Tenochtitlan's ceremonial center. More importantly, the success of the rebellion demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's military and administrative innovations, providing a template for future conquests throughout Mesoamerica. The consolidation of Triple Alliance power following the defeat of Azcapotzalco created unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion. The tribute flowing from former Tepanec territories provided the economic resources necessary to maintain professional armies, while the alliance's demonstrated military effectiveness attracted additional city-states seeking protection or partnership. Within a decade of Maxtla's death, the Confederation controlled most of the Valley of Mexico and had begun extending its influence into the surrounding highland regions. Itzcoatl's death in 1440 brought to power his nephew Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, known to history as Moctezuma I, whose reign would witness the transformation of the Triple Alliance from a regional confederation into a true empire spanning much of central Mexico. The new Huitzilopochtli was approximately 35 years old at his accession, having spent his youth as a warrior in the campaigns against Azcapotzalco. Unlike his predecessor who had inherited a desperate struggle for survival, Moctezuma I faced the challenge of managing an expanding state while simultaneously conducting military campaigns. The first major expansion under Moctezuma I targeted the Aztec peoples of the Gulf Coast, a region that had remained largely independent of central Mexican influence. The Huasteca encompassed the fertile coastal plains stretching from the Sierra Madre Oriental to the Gulf of Mexico, an area characterized by abundant rainfall, rich alluvial soils, and access to valuable resources including cotton, cacao, and tropical bird feathers prized for ceremonial purposes. The conquest of the Huasteca required innovative solutions from Mexica planners. The logistical challenges of conducting military operations in the tropical lowlands were formidable. The climate created health hazards for highland warriors unaccustomed to high humidity and endemic diseases. Dense forest cover made traditional infantry formations ineffective, while numerous rivers and swamps hindered the movement of large armies. The Mexica forces that eventually invaded the Huasteca in the mid-1440s represented a significant departure from traditional highland military organization. Rather than massive armies, Moctezuma I deployed smaller, more mobile units capable of operating effectively in difficult terrain. These expeditionary forces included specialists trained in jungle warfare, engineers capable of constructing temporary bridges, and medical personnel familiar with tropical diseases. The campaign unfolded over several years as Mexica forces systematically reduced Huastec strongholds while establishing permanent garrisons. The conquest of the Huasteca provided the Mexica Empire with access to resources unavailable in the highland regions. Cotton grown in the coastal lowlands became a crucial component of the imperial tribute system. The region's cacao production supplied the beans used as currency throughout Mesoamerica. Exotic bird feathers from the tropical forests adorned the ceremonial costumes of nobles and priests in Tenochtitlan. Following the consolidation of Mexica control over the Huasteca, Moctezuma I turned his attention to the southern regions, targeting the Mixtec and Zapotec peoples of Oaxaca. This mountainous region presented different challenges from the coastal lowlands. The terrain was characterized by deep valleys separated by rugged highlands that made military movement difficult. The Mixtec peoples had developed complex kingdoms centered around fortified hilltop cities that controlled surrounding agricultural valleys. The conquest of Oaxaca required a different approach from the rapid campaigns that had proven successful in other regions. The mountainous terrain favored defensive warfare, allowing relatively small forces to hold strategic passes against much larger armies. Moctezuma I's strategy emphasized the systematic reduction of enemy strongholds through prolonged siege warfare. The campaigns in Oaxaca extended over nearly a decade as Mexica forces methodically conquered one valley after another while establishing permanent garrisons. The wealth extracted from Oaxacan territories more than compensated for the costs of conquest. The region was renowned throughout Mesoamerica for its skilled craftsmen who produced luxury goods including gold jewelry, carved jade ornaments, and elaborately decorated textiles. The death of Moctezuma I in 1469 brought to power his son Ashiacatl, a young ruler whose reign would be marked by both spectacular military successes and costly failures. Ashiacatl was approximately 20 years old at his accession. The most pressing challenge facing the new Huitzilopochtli involved the growing independence of Tlatelolco, the sister city that had developed into a major commercial center. The conflict between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco reflected deeper tensions within Mexican society about the proper relationship between commercial and military activities. Tlatelolco's merchants had accumulated vast wealth through their trading expeditions, but they lacked the military achievements that traditionally conferred high status. The immediate cause of the war involved a succession dispute in Tlatelolco that provided Axayacatl with a pretext for military intervention. The siege of Tlatelolco in 1473 demonstrated the military innovations developed during previous decades of imperial expansion. Mexican engineers constructed elaborate siege works that isolated the city from external support. The fall of Tlatelolco marked the end of independent Mexican city-states and the consolidation of imperial authority under Tenochtitlan's direct control. Axayacatl's attention then turned westward to the Tarascan Empire, a powerful confederation centered in the region now known as Michoacán. The Tarascans had developed a sophisticated military organization based on bronze weapons and disciplined infantry formations. Their capital at Tzintzuntzin controlled extensive territories rich in copper, silver, and other metals essential for producing the bronze tools and weapons that gave Tarascan forces their technological advantage. The Tarascan Empire presented the most formidable military challenge that Mexican forces had yet encountered. Unlike the city-states of central Mexico, the Tarascans had developed centralized military institutions capable of fielding large, well-equipped armies under unified command. Their bronze weapons were superior to obsidian implements in both durability and effectiveness. The campaign against the Tarascans began in 1478 with a series of probing attacks. The decisive battle occurred on a broad plain suitable for large-scale infantry combat. Axayacatl had assembled the largest army in Mexican history, drawing warriors from throughout the empire. The Tarascan force was smaller but better equipped and more cohesively organized. When the infantry lines met, the superior metallurgy of Tarascan weapons became decisive. Bronze swords and spear points cut through cotton armor and wooden shields that had provided adequate protection against obsidian weapons. The defeat at the hands of the Tarascans represented the first major military setback in Mexican imperial expansion and demonstrated the limitations of traditional Mesoamerican military technology. The Tarascan frontier remained the western limit of Aztec expansion throughout the empire's existence. Despite this setback, Axayacatl's reign saw significant expansion in other directions. Campaigns to the south extended Mexican control deeper into Oaxaca and toward the Pacific coast. The tribute flowing from these conquests continued to enrich Tenochtitlan and fund further construction projects. The reign of Tizoc, who succeeded Axayacatl in 1481, was notably less successful in military terms. His campaigns achieved mixed results, and his failure to match the conquests of his predecessors created dissatisfaction among the warrior nobility. Tizoc's death in 1486, possibly the result of poisoning by nobles dissatisfied with his leadership, brought to power his younger brother Axayacatl. Axayacatl's reign from 1486 to 1502 was marked by almost constant warfare as Mexican armies campaigned from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean and from the northern deserts to the southern highlands. Axayacatl proved to be perhaps the most militarily gifted ruler in Mexican history, personally leading campaigns that conquered dozens of cities and incorporated vast new territories. Under his leadership, the Aztec Empire reached its maximum extent, controlling perhaps 5 million people across an area of approximately 200,000 square kilometers. The expansion under Axayacatl required significant modifications to imperial administrative systems. Provincial administration became more standardized, with imperial officials exercising greater direct control over conquered territories. The tribute system was refined to extract maximum value while maintaining local economic viability. Military garrisons were established in strategic locations throughout the empire. The reign of Axayacatl also witnessed the completion of the great reconstruction of the Templo Mayor, the dual pyramid temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The dedication ceremony in 1487 was marked by sacrifices on a scale unprecedented in Mesoamerican history, with thousands of captives offered to the gods over several days. This spectacular ritual demonstrated Mexican power to divine and human audiences alike. By the end of Axayacatl's reign in 1502, the Aztec Empire had reached the zenith of its power and territorial extent. The tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan supported a population in the imperial capital that may have reached 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Yet this magnificent civilization was approaching the peak from which it would soon descend. The ascension of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to history as Moctezuma II, to the throne of Tenochtitlan in 1502 marked the beginning of the most magnificent and ultimately tragic period in Aztec history. At approximately 34 years of age, Moctezuma II inherited an empire that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing diverse peoples, climates, and resources that generated unprecedented wealth for the Triple Alliance. The new Huitzilopochtli possessed impeccable credentials for his elevated position, having served as a high priest of Huitzilopochtli before his election. His religious training had provided him with comprehensive knowledge of the ritual calendar, astronomical calculations, and theological principles that governed Aztec society. Moctezuma II's education in the Calmecac had emphasized the intellectual and ceremonial aspects of leadership rather than the purely military focus of earlier rulers, reflecting the empire's evolution into a sophisticated administrative state. The administrative reforms implemented during Moctezuma II's reign transformed the imperial government from a relatively loose collection of tributary relationships into a centralized bureaucracy. The emperor established new governmental departments responsible for specific aspects of imperial administration, including tribute collection, military organization, judicial proceedings, and religious ceremonies. Each department was staffed by professional administrators drawn from the ranks of the nobility. The tribute collection system reached its most sophisticated form under Moctezuma II's direction. Imperial scribes created elaborate codices that documented the specific goods required from each tributary province, the quantities expected, and the dates when deliveries were due. These administrative documents represented masterpieces of pictographic art and practical organization. The provinces of the Gulf Coast contributed vast quantities of cotton textiles, cacao beans, tropical bird feathers, and precious stones. The highland regions provided obsidian, timber, maize, beans, and other agricultural products. The coastal areas supplied salt, dried fish, and shells used in jewelry and ceremonial objects. Each tributary province was assessed according to its population, agricultural productivity, and access to valuable resources. The wealth generated by this systematic tribute collection enabled Moctezuma II to maintain a court of unprecedented luxury. The imperial palace in Tenochtitlan expanded to encompass multiple buildings housing thousands of servants, administrators, craftsmen, and guards. The palace complex included private apartments for the royal family, audience halls where foreign dignitaries presented tribute, workshops where skilled artisans created luxury goods, and gardens where exotic plants and animals were displayed as symbols of imperial dominion. The emperor's daily routine reflected the ceremonial nature of Aztec kingship. Moctezuma II began each day with elaborate purification rituals including bathing in sacred spring water, burning copal incense, and offering his own blood to the gods through tongue and ear piercing. These private ceremonies were followed by public appearances in which the emperor received reports from provincial governors, heard legal cases, and conducted religious observances. The emperor's meals exemplified the abundance available to the imperial court. Palace kitchens prepared hundreds of different dishes daily, utilizing ingredients imported from every corner of the empire. Fresh fish arrived daily from both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, transported by relay runners who covered hundreds of kilometers in less than 2 days. Tropical fruits were preserved in honey or dried for year-round consumption. Game birds were kept alive in palace aviaries until needed for imperial banquets. The construction projects undertaken during Moctezuma II's reign transformed Tenochtitlan into one of the most magnificent cities in the world. The Templo Mayor underwent its final major expansion, rising approximately 60 meters above the surrounding plaza. The twin shrines at the summit, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, were reconstructed with walls covered in brilliantly colored stucco and decorated with elaborate sculptural elements. The ceremonial plaza surrounding the Templo Mayor was expanded to accommodate the massive crowds that gathered for major religious festivals. The plaza's stone pavement was laid in geometric patterns that reflected astronomical alignments and cosmological principles. The ball court where the ritual game Tlachtli was played was rebuilt with more elaborate side walls and viewing platforms. The palace complex adjacent to the ceremonial center underwent similar expansion. The emperor's private residence included multiple courtyards planted with flowers and shade trees, reflecting pools that provided cooling and aviaries where exotic birds were maintained. The palace workshops employed hundreds of skilled artisans who created magnificent objects that adorned the imperial court. Feather workers crafted elaborate headdresses using tropical bird plumage. The most valued feathers came from the quetzal bird, whose long green tail feathers were worth more than gold. Goldsmiths created jewelry using techniques including casting, hammering, and filigree work. Lapidaries carved jade, turquoise, obsidian, and other precious stones into ornaments whose symbolic meanings were understood by educated nobles. The expansion of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure included the construction of new causeways, additional aqueducts, and expanded canal systems. The causeways were widened to accommodate increased traffic, with more sophisticated bridge systems. The aqueduct system was expanded through construction of a double-channel aqueduct from Chapultepec, allowing one channel to be cleaned while the other continued supplying water. The market at Tlatelolco represented one of the most sophisticated commercial institutions in the pre-Columbian Americas. The market plaza could accommodate over 60,000 people on major trading days, with specialized sections devoted to different categories of merchandise. Food vendors offered prepared meals and fresh produce. Craft specialists sold pottery, textiles, and obsidian tools. Merchants from distant regions displayed exotic goods. The social life of Tenochtitlan during Moctezuma II's reign reflected increasing stratification. The Pipiltin lived in spacious stone houses, wore elaborate costumes made from fine cotton textiles decorated with featherwork, and consumed exotic foods. They were educated in the Kalmakak schools where they learned reading, writing, astronomy, and ceremonial protocols. The Massahualtin lived in modest houses, wore simple clothing, and subsisted primarily on maize and beans. Despite these inequalities, Aztec society maintained mechanisms for social mobility. Exceptional warriors could earn noble status through capturing important enemies, while successful merchants could accumulate substantial wealth. Religious observances permeated every aspect of life in Tenochtitlan. The major festivals that marked the passage of the 1820-day months required elaborate preparations. Each festival honored specific deities and involved distinctive ceremonies including processions, dances, songs, dramatic reenactments of mythological events, and sacrificial offerings. The practice of human sacrifice reached its most elaborate form during Moctezuma II's reign. The Aztecs recognized multiple forms of sacrificial death appropriate to different deities. Heart extraction remained the most common method. Drowning was preferred for victims offered to water deities. Flaying was employed in ceremonies honoring Totec. Burning alive was reserved for victims offered to the fire god. The number of individuals sacrificed annually remains debated, with estimates ranging from several hundred to several thousand. What is clear is that human sacrifice served multiple functions beyond religious significance. The spectacular ceremonies demonstrated the power of the state, created awe and fear among subjects and enemies, and provided motivation for Aztec warfare. Yet even as Moctezuma II presided over this magnificent civilization at its height, ominous signs began appearing. Beginning around 1510, unusual natural phenomena and supernatural occurrences created an atmosphere of anxiety. A comet appeared in the pre-dawn sky for several months, interpreted as a warning of impending catastrophe. The temple of Huitzilopochtli was destroyed by a mysterious fire. The temple of Xiautecutli was struck by lightning during clear sky. Strange voices were heard crying in the night. The most disturbing manifestations involved ghostly figures and monstrous beings witnessed by reliable observers. Fishermen reported seeing a woman walking on the lake surface, weeping and lamenting the fate awaiting her children. Hunters encountered two-headed creatures. These omens created genuine fear and prompted Moctezuma II to consult with learned priests and astronomers. The most significant prophetic tradition involved the expected return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who had ruled during a golden age before departing across the eastern sea with promises to return. According to Aztec astronomical calculations, the year 1519 in the European calendar corresponded to Suacatl in the indigenous dating system, creating expectations that the god's return was imminent. The prophecies described Quetzalcoatl as appearing as a bearded, light-skinned man arriving from the east. This theological framework would profoundly influence Aztec interpretations of the Spanish arrival. As 1519 approached, Moctezuma II presided over an empire that appeared secure and prosperous. The capital city was a marvel of engineering and architecture. Yet beneath this magnificent surface lay vulnerabilities, the resentments of subject peoples, divisions among indigenous city-states, and theological uncertainties created by prophecies. The stage was set for a dramatic encounter between civilizations that would end in the destruction of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish expedition that would forever alter Mesoamerican history began not with grand imperial designs but with the pragmatic ambitions of Cuban colonists seeking new sources of wealth. Governor Diego Velázquez de Cuellar had dispatched two previous expeditions, first under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, then underwent a Grijalva in 1518. Both returned with tantalizing reports of sophisticated civilizations, abundant gold and densely populated cities. Hernán Cortés, a minor hidalgo from Extremadura who had spent 15 years in the Caribbean, possessed the combination of ambition, administrative experience and political connections necessary to organize the most ambitious expedition yet attempted. Born around 1485 in Medellín, Cortés had briefly studied law at the University of Salamanca before abandoning his education to seek his fortune in the New World. The expedition that departed Cuba in February 1519 consisted of 11 ships carrying approximately 630 Spanish soldiers, sailors and adventurers, along with several hundred indigenous auxiliaries from the Caribbean islands. The Spanish contingent included 32 crossbowmen, 13 musketeers, 16 cavalrymen with their horses, and several hundred soldiers armed with steel swords, pikes and shields. The expedition also carried 14 small cannons. The technological advantages possessed by the Spanish forces extended beyond superior metallurgy and gunpowder weapons. Steel weapons maintained their sharpness far longer than obsidian implements and could penetrate cotton armor. Metal helmets and breastplates provided protection against arrows and clubs. The horses, unknown in the Americas before European arrival, created psychological shock among indigenous peoples while providing unprecedented mobility. The expedition's first significant encounter occurred along the coast of Yucatan, where Maya communities had maintained their independence. Initial contacts followed patterns established during previous explorations, with indigenous leaders attempting to assess European intentions while Spanish commanders sought information about regional politics and resources. The Spanish landing at the mouth of the Grijalva River brought the expedition into contact with the Cantal Maya peoples of Tabasco. The Battle of Centla in March 1519 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Spanish military technology. The Cantal warriors employed dense formations brandishing obsidian-edged weapons. Their cotton armor and wooden shields proved inadequate against Spanish steel swords and crossbow bolts. The Spanish cavalry charge that broke the Maya battle line created panic among indigenous warriors who had never encountered horses and initially believed that horse and rider formed a single supernatural creature. The thunderous noise of Spanish cannons combined with acrid smoke and screams transformed the battlefield into chaos that overwhelmed traditional Maya military discipline. The Spanish victory was complete and decisive. The aftermath of the battle brought Cortés one of his most crucial advantages. Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Dona Marina or La Malinche. She was among 20 young women presented to the Spanish as tribute by the defeated Cantal leaders. Born into the Nahuatl-speaking nobility of central Mexico, she had been sold into slavery as a child and had learned Maya during her years of captivity, making her uniquely qualified to serve as interpreter and cultural advisor. Malintzin's role extended far beyond simple translation. She possessed intimate knowledge of Mesoamerican political systems, religious practices, and social hierarchies that enabled her to advise Spanish commanders on appropriate protocols. Her understanding of indigenous concepts of authority and alliance systems proved crucial for Spanish efforts to exploit divisions among potential enemies and recruit indigenous allies. The Spanish expedition's arrival at the Totonac city of Sempoala in June 1519 provided Cortés with his first major indigenous allies. The Totonac peoples controlled the fertile coastal plains and had been subjected to heavy Aztec tribute obligations. The Totonac caciques who received the Spanish expedition expressed bitter resentment against Aztec rule and eagerness to support any force capable of challenging imperial authority. The alliance between the Spanish expedition and the Totonac Confederation was formalized through ceremonies that combined European and indigenous diplomatic traditions. The Totonacs provided the Spanish with thousands of indigenous warriors, detailed maps of routes to the highland regions and logistical support. The most dramatic demonstration of this alliance occurred when Cortés ordered his Totonac allies to arrest Aztec tribute collectors who had arrived in Sempoala. This unprecedented act of defiance sent shock waves throughout the region while establishing Cortés as a potential alternative to Aztec imperial authority. The Spanish decision to establish Villa Rica de la Veracruz as a permanent settlement reflected Cortés's understanding of Spanish legal traditions. The foundation of a municipality provided legal justification for Spanish presence while creating governmental institutions that could issue orders and conduct diplomatic negotiations. The town council elected Cortés as Captain General, formally granting him authority to conduct military operations without reference to Governor Velázquez's original instructions. The Spanish march toward Tenochtitlan began in August 1519 with a combined force of approximately 400 Spanish soldiers and several thousand Totonac warriors. The route led through the territory of the Tlaxcalan Confederation, a collection of 4 city-states that had maintained their independence against Aztec expansion. The Tlaxcalans controlled important trade routes and had developed specialized tactics for fighting against Aztec forces. The initial encounters between Spanish forces and Tlaxcalan warriors demonstrated the complex political calculations that indigenous leaders made when confronted with European military technology. Tlaxcalan commanders initially treated the Spanish as potential Aztec allies and launched attacks designed to test European military capabilities. The fierce battles that followed revealed both the effectiveness of Spanish weapons and the courage of indigenous warriors who continued fighting despite heavy casualties. The aftermath of the military confrontations prompted intensive debates within Tlaxcalan leadership councils. The younger war leaders who had advocated continued resistance found their positions undermined by casualties suffered in battle and the obvious effectiveness of Spanish weapons. Older nobles who had opposed war with the Spanish gained influence and began negotiations that would transform the Tlaxcalans from enemies into the most important indigenous allies of the conquest campaign. The Spanish entry into the city of Tlaxcala in September 1519 marked a crucial turning point. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the Spanish expedition with approximately 6,000 warriors, detailed intelligence about Aztec military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, and logistical support. More importantly, the Tlaxcalan alliance demonstrated to other indigenous communities that Spanish military technology could provide effective protection against Aztec retaliation. The Spanish massacre at Cholula in October 1519 revealed the brutal methods that European commanders were prepared to employ against indigenous communities suspected of treachery. Cholula was one of the most important religious centers in Mesoamerica. The city's rulers had submitted to Spanish authority, but Cortés received warnings from Tlaxcalan allies and Malintzin that Colulan leaders were planning an ambush in coordination with Aztec forces. The preemptive attack ordered by Cortés resulted in the deaths of thousands of Colulan civilians and the destruction of major portions of the city, including several important temples. The massacre served as a demonstration of Spanish military capabilities while warning other indigenous communities about the consequences of resistance or betrayal. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate vicinity as reports of Spanish brutality spread throughout central Mexico. News of the Spanish advance toward Tenochtitlan reached Moctezuma II through extensive intelligence networks. The emperor's initial responses reflected a complex mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and religious speculation. The technological superiority demonstrated by Spanish forces, combined with their association with indigenous enemies of the empire, suggested that these foreigners represented a significant threat to imperial authority. The gifts sent by Moctezuma II to the Spanish expedition included magnificent examples of Aztec craftsmanship designed to demonstrate imperial wealth and artistic sophistication. The treasure included elaborate featherwork headdresses, golden ornaments depicting Aztec deities, jade jewelry, and cotton textiles decorated with complex patterns. These diplomatic presents reflected traditional Mesoamerican practices of gift exchange between rulers while attempting to establish peaceful relationships. The Spanish reception of these gifts revealed fundamental misunderstandings about indigenous political systems. Spanish commanders interpreted the valuable presents as evidence of vast wealth awaiting conquest rather than as diplomatic overtures requiring reciprocal gestures of respect and friendship. The European focus on the precious metals contained in Aztec gifts demonstrated cultural incomprehension that made meaningful diplomatic resolution increasingly unlikely. The emperor's decision to receive the Spanish expedition in Tenochtitlan reflected complex calculations about military capabilities, religious obligations, and political necessities. Moctezuma II possessed detailed intelligence about Spanish military technology and indigenous alliance systems while also confronting the theological implications of prophecies concerning Quetzalcoatl's return and the potential divine nature of the European visitors. The Spanish entry into Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, represented one of the most extraordinary encounters in human history. The Spanish soldiers who crossed the causeway from the mainland to the island city found themselves surrounded by architectural marvels, engineering achievements, and artistic creations that challenged European assumptions about indigenous capabilities while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of Aztec civilization. The initial meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma II occurred according to indigenous ceremonial protocols that emphasized the divine nature of rulership. The emperor, carried on a golden litter and shaded by a canopy of precious feathers, wore garments that incorporated the finest materials available in Mesoamerica. The Spanish captain general, dressed in his finest European clothing and accompanied by his most trusted officers, attempted to reciprocate these ceremonial gestures while maintaining appropriate dignity. The Spanish accommodation in the Palace of Aztec provided European visitors with unprecedented access to the inner workings of Aztec imperial administration while placing them in a position of potential vulnerability within the heart of what they now understood to be enemy territory. The palace complex included residential quarters for the Spanish soldiers, stables for their horses, and storage areas for their equipment. The weeks following the Spanish arrival witnessed a complex series of negotiations, ceremonies, and misunderstandings that reflected the fundamental incompatibility between European and indigenous concepts of political authority, religious obligation, and territorial sovereignty. Spanish demands for tribute payments, religious conversion, and political submission conflicted with Aztec expectations of diplomatic reciprocity, cultural respect, and recognition of imperial authority. The arrest of Moctezuma II by Spanish forces in November 1519 represented a desperate attempt by Cortés to maintain control over an increasingly dangerous situation through manipulation of indigenous political institutions. The seizure of the emperor violated fundamental principles of Aztec political theory while demonstrating Spanish willingness to employ extreme measures. The emperor's captivity created a constitutional crisis within the imperial government while undermining the religious foundations of Aztec authority. For the Mexica people, their Huitzilopochtli was not merely a political leader but a sacred figure whose person embodied the connection between the human and divine realms. To see him held prisoner by foreign invaders was almost incomprehensible, yet Moctezuma II, for reasons that remain debated by historians, cooperated with his captors and attempted to maintain the functioning of imperial government despite his imprisonment. The months of uneasy coexistence between the Spanish occupiers and the Aztec population came to a violent end with the massacre at the Templo Mayor during the Festival of Tenochtitlan in May 1520. Pedro de Alvarado, left in command of Tenochtitlan while Cortés dealt with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, ordered his soldiers to attack Aztec nobles who were participating in traditional religious ceremonies within the main temple complex. The Spanish assault killed hundreds of unarmed participants, including many of the most important political and religious leaders in the empire, while desecrating the sacred spaces that formed the spiritual center of Aztec civilization. The motivations for this unprovoked attack remain unclear, whether Alvarado acted from fear of a suspected uprising, from greed for the gold jewelry worn by the celebrants, or from religious zeal to suppress what he viewed as diabolic practices. The indigenous uprising that followed the Templo Mayor massacre reflected the accumulated resentments and religious outrage that had been building since the Spanish arrival. Aztec warriors, coordinated by surviving members of the Imperial Council, launched coordinated attacks against Spanish positions while cutting the causeways that connected the island city to the mainland. The siege of the Spanish positions in Aztec's palace demonstrated indigenous capabilities for sustained military operations while revealing the vulnerability of European forces when deprived of their mobility. The death of Moctezuma II during the uprising remains one of the most controversial events of the conquest period, with Spanish and indigenous sources providing conflicting accounts. Spanish chronicles claimed that Moctezuma was killed by stones thrown by his own subjects when he attempted to address the crowd and restore order. Indigenous accounts suggested that Spanish soldiers murdered their captive when his usefulness as a puppet ruler had ended. Whatever the truth of his death, Moctezuma II's passing eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement while creating a succession crisis. La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, of June 30, 1520, witnessed the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan under cover of darkness as Cortés attempted to evacuate his forces before the Aztec siege could completely eliminate European military capabilities. The Spanish column, burdened with treasure looted from imperial palaces and temples, attempted to cross the western causeway while under constant attack from Aztec warriors in war canoes who had anticipated the escape attempt. The retreat became a rout as Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold and silver, drowned in the lake while indigenous allies were overwhelmed by superior numbers of enemy forces. The narrow causeway, with its destroyed bridges creating gaps that could only be crossed by swimming or using makeshift portable bridges, became a killing ground where hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies perished. The casualties suffered during La Noche Triste reduced Spanish military strength by more than half while eliminating many of the indigenous allies who had provided crucial support. The survivors who reached the safety of Tlaxcalan territory faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding their forces while confronting an emboldened Aztec empire that had demonstrated its capacity to defeat European military technology. The succession of Cuitlahuac to the position of Huitzilopochtli in early 1520 marked a fundamental transformation in Aztec leadership philosophy. Unlike his predecessors who had attempted to accommodate Spanish demands through negotiation and compromise, Cuitlahuac represented the militant faction that advocated total war against the European invaders and their indigenous allies. The new emperor was a younger brother of Moctezuma II and had distinguished himself as a military commander. Cuitlahuac's brief reign lasted only 80 days before he succumbed to smallpox in early December 1520, becoming one of the countless victims of the epidemic diseases that accompanied Spanish conquest efforts. The smallpox outbreak that swept through central Mexico during 1520 and early 1521 killed enormous numbers of indigenous people who had no immunity to this old-world disease. The epidemic not only reduced the absolute numbers of potential warriors available for imperial defense but also disrupted the social and political institutions that coordinated military resistance. The succession of Cuauhtémoc following Cuitlahuac's death brought to power the last independent ruler of the Aztec Empire. Cuauhtémoc, whose name meant descending eagle, was approximately 25 years old when he assumed the throne in early 1521, making him the youngest ruler in Aztec history and a leader whose entire adult experience had been shaped by the crisis of foreign invasion and imperial collapse. Cuauhtémoc's military strategy emphasized the advantages that indigenous forces possessed in the unique environment of the Valley of Mexico, particularly their superior knowledge of local terrain and their ability to coordinate operations across the complex system of lakes, islands, and causeways. The emperor recognized that Spanish cavalry and artillery were most effective in open terrain where their mobility and firepower could be fully utilized, while the confined spaces of urban warfare and the aquatic environment neutralized many European tactical advantages. Under Cuauhtémoc's direction, Tenochtitlan was transformed into a fortress capable of withstanding prolonged siege warfare. The emperor ordered the construction of additional defensive works along the causeways, including stone barriers, earthworks, and concealed positions for archers and spear throwers. The canal system was modified to create defensive obstacles that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The systematic destruction of bridges along the causeways created gaps that could only be crossed by swimming or using portable bridges. The Spanish siege strategy developed by Cortés during his months of preparation in Tlaxcalan territory reflected lessons learned from the disastrous retreat of La Noche Triste. The Spanish commander recognized that direct assault against Tenochtitlan's fortifications would result in prohibitive casualties while failing to achieve decisive results. The most innovative aspect of Spanish siege preparations was the construction of brigantines, shallow draft vessels that would enable European forces to control the lake system. The ships were built in Tlaxcala using timber cut in the mountains and transported by thousands of indigenous allies. The vessels incorporated European shipbuilding techniques while being specifically designed for the unique conditions of Lake Texcoco. Each brigantine measured approximately 12 meters in length and carried a crew of Spanish sailors supported by indigenous rowers. The vessels were armed with small cannons and swivel guns that could fire grapeshot against enemy canoes and defensive positions. The Spanish alliance system that supported the siege of Tenochtitlan represented one of the most successful examples of European indigenous cooperation during the conquest period, as tens of thousands of native warriors joined Spanish forces in attacking the Aztec capital. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the largest contingent of allied forces, contributing approximately 50,000 warriors. Additional indigenous allies joined from throughout central Mexico, including communities that had recently thrown off Aztec rule. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in earnest during May 1521 with coordinated attacks against the causeways. Spanish forces supported by their indigenous allies launched simultaneous assaults against the northern, western, and southern approaches to the city while the brigantines established control over the lake waters. The fighting along the causeways proved exceptionally brutal and costly for both sides. The systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure became a central component of Spanish siege strategy. Cortés ordered the demolition of buildings, temples, and other structures that could serve as defensive positions, while also destroying the aqueducts and canal systems that supplied fresh water to the city's population. This scorched earth approach created significant hardships for the civilian population while reducing the tactical advantages that indigenous forces derived from their intimate knowledge of urban terrain. The siege's impact on Tenochtitlan's civilian population created humanitarian disasters. The Spanish blockade prevented the importation of food supplies from the mainland, while the destruction of Chinampas eliminated local food production. The combination of military action and epidemic disease created conditions of extreme hardship for non-combatants trapped within the besieged city without adequate supplies of food, water, or medical care. Cuauhtémoc's efforts to maintain civilian morale and military effectiveness despite these deteriorating conditions demonstrated remarkable leadership capabilities and personal courage. The emperor continued to appear in public ceremonies and military planning sessions despite obvious dangers, while also participating directly in combat operations. His visible presence during the most difficult phases of the siege provided psychological support for defenders who might otherwise have lost hope. The fighting during the final weeks of the siege reached levels of intensity and brutality that shocked even experienced Spanish veterans. Aztec warriors facing certain death or enslavement fought with desperate courage in hand-to-hand combat that often continued for hours in individual buildings and courtyards. Spanish soldiers found themselves engaged in urban warfare that negated many of their technological advantages while exposing them to constant danger from hidden defenders. The capture of Cuauhtémoc on August 13, 1521, occurred during the emperor's attempt to escape from the fallen city in a war canoe accompanied by his family and closest advisors. Spanish brigantines patrolling the lake intercepted the imperial party as they attempted to reach the mainland where loyal forces might have enabled continued resistance. The emperor's capture eliminated the last legitimate source of imperial authority while providing Spanish forces with a valuable prisoner. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the definitive end of the Aztec Empire as an independent political entity. The magnificent city that had taken nearly 2 centuries to build lay in ruins, its temples demolished, its palaces burned, its canals choked with debris and corpses. The population had been decimated by warfare, disease, and starvation, with perhaps 100,000 people having perished during the 3-month siege. The survivors faced an uncertain future under Spanish colonial rule, their political institutions destroyed, their religious practices suppressed, their economic systems disrupted. The conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked not an ending but a transformation, as the cultural, linguistic, and agricultural legacy of the Aztec Empire would continue to shape Mexican society for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath saw systematic destruction of much of the material culture of the empire, with temples demolished, codices burned, and religious artifacts melted down. Yet beneath this surface devastation, countless elements of Aztec civilization survived, adapted, and eventually influenced the colonial society that emerged from the ruins. The Nahuatl language proved remarkably resilient, continuing as the primary means of communication for millions of people throughout central Mexico during the colonial period and into the present day. Spanish colonial authorities initially encouraged the use of Nahuatl as a lingua franca for communication with diverse indigenous populations, leading to the development of standardized writing systems that enabled the production of Christian texts, legal documents, and administrative records in the native language. Franciscan missionaries like Bernardino de Sahagun worked with indigenous scholars to create comprehensive dictionaries and grammars that preserved detailed knowledge of pre-conquest Nahuatl literature, historical traditions, and religious practices. Today, approximately 1.5 million people continue to speak Nahuatl and related languages, maintaining direct linguistic connections to the Aztec Empire. The language has also contributed numerous words to Spanish and, through Spanish, to English and other world languages. Words like chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, and coyote all derive from Nahuatl origins. Agricultural practices developed during the Aztec period continued to form the foundation of food production throughout central Mexico. The Chinampa farming method pioneered in the lakes surrounding Tenochtitlan remained in use throughout the colonial period and continues to be practiced today in the Xochimilco district of Mexico City, where the ancient artificial islands still produce vegetables and flowers for urban markets. These Chinampas represent living connections to Aztec agricultural innovations. The introduction of European domesticated animals, particularly cattle, horses, pigs, and sheep, created new opportunities for indigenous farmers while also disrupting traditional agricultural systems. Indigenous communities adapted their farming practices to accommodate these new animals, developing integrated agricultural systems that combine traditional crop cultivation with European-style animal husbandry. The adoption of iron tools and plows introduced by Spanish colonists increased agricultural productivity while reducing labor requirements. Traditional craft production techniques survived the conquest period and continued to influence colonial manufacturing. Indigenous craftsmen maintained their expertise in textile production, pottery making, and metalworking while adapting their skills to produce goods that met colonial market demands. The featherwork traditions that had created some of the most spectacular examples of Aztec art continued during the early colonial period, with indigenous artisans producing elaborate religious ornaments for Catholic churches. Religious syncretism represented one of the most complex and enduring aspects of cultural adaptation following the Spanish conquest. Indigenous populations developed innovative approaches to reconciling traditional spiritual practices with the requirements of Catholic orthodoxy, creating hybrid religious forms that incorporated elements of both traditions. The Virgin of Guadalupe, whose apparition to the indigenous peasant Juan Diego in 1531 occurred at the site of a former temple dedicated to the Aztec goddess Tenochtitlan, became the most prominent example of this religious fusion. The cult of Guadalupe incorporated indigenous symbolic elements while conforming to Catholic theological requirements, becoming a powerful symbol of Mexican national identity that united indigenous and Spanish heritage. Indigenous communities throughout central Mexico developed similar syncretic religious practices that preserved elements of pre-conquest spiritual traditions within the framework of Catholic worship. Traditional deities were reinterpreted as Christian saints with similar attributes, while indigenous ceremonies were modified to incorporate Catholic rituals and symbols. The rediscovery of Aztec archaeological sites during the late colonial period and accelerating after Mexican independence provided physical evidence of the civilization's achievements. The accidental discovery of the Coatlicue statue and the Aztec calendar stone in 1790 during construction work in Mexico City's main plaza provided the first major examples of monumental Aztec sculpture to receive scholarly attention, sparking interest in indigenous history and culture among educated elites. Systematic archaeological investigation of Aztec sites began during the 19th century as Mexican scholars and international researchers developed scientific approaches to studying pre-Columbian civilizations. The excavation of the Templo Mayor, beginning with limited investigations in the early 20th century and culminating in the comprehensive archaeological project initiated in 1978, revolutionized understanding of Aztec religious practices, urban development and imperial administration. The discovery of the Coyolxauhqui stone in 1978 prompted the Mexican government to authorize extensive excavations that revealed multiple construction phases of the Great Temple along with thousands of artifacts. These archaeological discoveries confirmed many of the descriptions found in Spanish colonial sources while also revealing aspects of Aztec religious practice that had not been documented in written records. The influence of Aztec civilization on Mexican national identity became particularly pronounced following the Mexican Revolution of 1910, as political leaders sought to create unifying cultural symbols. The adoption of the Aztec eagle and serpent symbol as the central element of the Mexican flag represented the most visible expression of this cultural nationalism, while government-sponsored art projects incorporated Aztec themes and motifs into public buildings and monuments. The muralist movement led by artists like Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros created powerful visual narratives that portrayed Aztec civilization as the foundation of Mexican national identity while criticizing Spanish colonialism. These monumental artworks, displayed in prominent public buildings throughout Mexico, presented idealized versions of pre-Columbian life that emphasized indigenous achievements in agriculture, architecture, and social organization. Educational reforms implemented during the 20th century incorporated comprehensive instruction about pre-Columbian civilizations into Mexican school curricula, ensuring that successive generations of students learned about Aztec achievements in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and artistic production. These educational initiatives sought to counter negative stereotypes about indigenous peoples while fostering appreciation for the sophisticated cultural traditions that had characterized pre-conquest Mesoamerica. Contemporary indigenous rights movements throughout Mexico have drawn inspiration from Aztec political and cultural traditions while advocating for recognition of indigenous land rights, cultural autonomy, and political representation. These movements have contributed to broader international discussions about indigenous rights and cultural preservation while demonstrating the continuing relevance of pre-Columbian political and social traditions. The global understanding of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican achievements has been fundamentally transformed by archaeological research and scholarly analysis that has revealed the sophistication of Aztec urban planning, agricultural systems, and administrative institutions. International recognition of Aztec accomplishments in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering has contributed to broader appreciation for indigenous intellectual traditions while challenging Eurocentric narratives about technological and cultural development. The influence of Aztec architectural and artistic traditions continues to be visible in contemporary Mexican and international design, with modern architects and artists incorporating pre-Columbian motifs, spatial concepts, and construction techniques into buildings, sculptures, and decorative arts. The The geometric patterns, symbolic imagery, and monumental scale that characterized Aztec artistic production have inspired countless contemporary works while also influencing urban planning projects. The legacy of the Aztec Empire extends far beyond its historical significance as a pre-Columbian political entity, encompassing continuing influences on language, culture, agriculture, and national identity that demonstrate the enduring power of indigenous traditions to adapt and survive despite centuries of colonialism and cultural suppression. The millions of people throughout Mexico and Central America who continue to speak Nahuatl and related languages maintain direct connections to the linguistic heritage of the Aztec Empire, while the agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and cultural practices that originated during the pre-conquest period continue to shape daily life in indigenous communities. The scholarly study of Aztec civilization has contributed to broader understanding of complex societies, imperial administration, and cultural adaptation. The sophisticated agricultural systems developed by Aztec farmers, particularly the Chinampa cultivation method, have attracted attention from modern agricultural researchers seeking sustainable approaches to food production in urban environments. The administrative innovations that enabled the Aztec Empire to govern diverse populations across vast territories provide valuable insights for contemporary political scientists and administrators. The tragic destruction of Aztec civilization during the Spanish conquest represents one of history's most dramatic examples of cultural collision and imperial expansion, while the survival and adaptation of indigenous traditions demonstrates the resilience of human societies confronting overwhelming challenges. The complex legacy of the Aztec Empire continues to influence contemporary Mexico and the broader world through its contributions to art, architecture, agriculture, and political thought, ensuring that this remarkable civilization remains a vital part of human cultural heritage more than 5 centuries after its fall. And so we reach the end of our long journey through time, having traveled from the misty homeland of Aztlan through 2 centuries of migration, witnessed the founding of Tenochtitlan on an island in a lake, followed the rise of an empire that would stretch from sea to sea, and finally observed the tragic encounter that would bring this magnificent civilization to its end. Yet as we have seen, endings are never truly final. The legacy of the Aztec Empire lives on in the millions who still speak Nahuatl, in the Chinampas that still float on the waters of Xochimilco, in the artistic traditions that continue to inspire, and in the cultural identity of modern Mexico that acknowledges and honors its indigenous roots. Let this story remind you of the great sweep of human history, of civilizations that rise and fall like the sun that Huitzilopochtli represented, each leaving its mark upon the world, each contributing to the rich fabric of human achievement and experience. As you drift now towards sleep, let go of the details, let go of the names and dates, and simply hold on to the essential truth, that human beings, working together with determination and vision, can create wonders that endure across the centuries. Feel yourself floating above that ancient valley now, looking down upon the shimmering lakes, imagining the great city as it once was in all its glory, then watch it fade gently into the mist of time as you drift deeper into peaceful rest. The story has been told, the journey is complete, and you can let yourself sink now into the quiet darkness of sleep, carrying with you perhaps a sense of connection to those who lived so long ago, who dreamed their dreams and built their world, who loved and struggled and created beauty that still echoes down through the ages. Before you go completely into sleep, if you enjoyed this journey through history and would like to take more of these peaceful voyages through time with me, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows me to continue creating these stories that blend education with relaxation, bringing history to life in a way that can both inform your mind and calm your spirit. Share your thoughts in the comments about which historical civilization you would like to explore next, and I will do my best to bring those stories to you. But for now, simply rest. Let the story fade. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. The Aztec Empire, in all its glory and tragedy, is now part of the knowledge you carry, but you need not think about it anymore tonight. Just sleep, peaceful and deep, knowing that tomorrow awaits with its own adventures, but tonight belongs to rest. Good night and sleep well.